Hi, and welcome to the Liam Scheff Show on UCY TV and Truth Frequency Radio. Still trying to get onto people's internet radio. I just have to work out a more solid schedule because I'm traveling. What? Hi, welcome to the Liam Scheff Show on UCY TV and Truth Frequency Radio. Still trying to get you... Alright, that didn't make sense the first time. Why do it again? We're gonna be revisiting an interview with Gail Tverberg and Robert Scott Bell that we did last week about the exciting upcoming crash of everything based on oil production, decline in total oil availability, especially cheap oil, and the attachment of things like the banking system, the mortgage payments and interest rates, all that kind of wonky stuff that I don't usually get into. She's an expert in that. She's a very good writer on that, and we managed to get her on the Robert Scott Bell Show. So we're going to hear about a half hour of that interview. But in the beginning, first, there was the void. And out of the void came Ultron, and then Voltron, and then Iron Man, and then Black Widow, and Scarlet Witch, and Quicksilver, who dies at the end, apparently. Which is a truly waste of that character, because frankly they cast it better in the other one. Anyway, I'm not going to talk about that. I want to talk about myth a little bit. I was hanging out with my friend, who's a lovely, wonderful person. She homeschools, and and one of the teens was saying, "Oh, we're going to study myth." So we started, and she said, "Well, the Indians, over in India, the turmeric Indians, rather than the buffalo Indians and the corn Indians. So the turmeric Indians, the curry Indians." Have all kinds of myths. She said, they have all kinds of gods, all kinds of gods. I said, yeah, well, everybody has all kinds of gods. I mean, and my head is saying, well, the Hebrews had all kinds of gods. Well, I just waited till see where she was going to go. So she said, oh, they had all kinds of gods. And they have Shiva, and they have Kali Ma, she said, because she's watched the Temple of Doom. I said, well, I don't think that movie's a documentary, so... What is Shiva? Well, Shiva is the god whose dance is the dance of life and death, the dance of destruction, the dance that is the fire, the ending of moments, the ending of these moments that we have that give birth to other moments, the endings of seconds that give birth to new seconds, the endings of days, the endings of the period of light for the period of darkness, the period of darkness for the period of light. Shiva is the dance of the destruction of all things that gives the fertile soil that rebirths all things. Well, that's different, I said. That's different than the Western model of destruction. In the Western model of destruction, there is the creator God, Yahweh or El, or Elohim, or depending on who you're asking that day. And then there is the destructive force, which is really Yahweh. I mean, Yahweh does more destroying. Tell the truth, Yahweh does more destroying in the Bible than anybody else. Yahweh kills everybody on earth except Noah and the people that, his wife and the kids, that they, I guess, all have to have sex with each other to repopulate the earth. I don't remember that being explained in Sunday school. He kills everybody in Sodom and Gomorrah except for Lot and his wife. His wife turns around and, of course, is murdered, turned into a pillar of salt by Yahweh. So it's just Lot and his daughters who go up and stay in the cave, and his daughters get him drunk and have sex with him to repopulate the earth. Yes, it's the Bible, everybody. Then Yahweh. Then occasionally, a Satan character will come along, very rarely, by the way, and make a bet with God, like, "Oh, I bet these people wouldn't love you if you were mean to them." And God says, or Yahweh says, "I'm going to kill everybody that this guy loves. I'm going to take this guy Lot, and I'm going to kill everybody he loves and give him every disease in the world. And at the end, he'll still obey me." So that's the Old Testament. That's the Torah. Those are the stories that came out of Babylon and the early Hebrew settlements that people actually think is some sort of religious book, but it's a story of strange myths, strange stories. So she said, the Hindus have these strange stories of Shiva and Kali. And Kali, I said, well, Kali is the destructor goddess. She is the goddess of battlefields and plagues. Because in the world, when we have a problem and it's bigger than us, we make it into a person. And we make that person into a monster or a god, a giant, supernatural, superpowered. We do the same thing today, I said. And she said, yeah, well, those Indians are sort of weird. And I said, well, there are people here who are weird. There are people here who believe that there was a magician who could do magic. It was a wizard, actually. And he could do magic and do all kinds of wizardry. And he lived a long time ago, but he died. And he's going to come back. We don't know when. And he's going to put the devil in jail for 1,000 years. And she said, without missing a beat, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard. So, anybody paying attention will know what we're talking about. This is Liam Scheff on the Liam Scheff Show. And she's, by the way, a devout Christian. And what I said was this. When you take the myth and apply pure critical logic to it, it is clearly not true. It is clearly metaphorical. It is clearly psychological. And it is clearly emotional. That wizard, of course, is Jesus. That magician. It's not an historical figure that anybody can really prove. He's supposed to come back at some point. He was supposed to come back in like the next season, but he didn't, so they just kept extending it. And put the devil in jail for 1,000 years, so it says in Revelation. Which was a sequel to John, which was a sequel to Luke, which was a sequel to Matthew, which was a sequel to Mark, which was a sequel to Moses and Isaiah, which was a sequel to Elisha and Elijah. Really. We got a lot of sequels going on right now. So I sat and I talked with this teen and the mom, and I said, you do realize, though, that people believe in things that aren't real, but they make them real through their belief. Well, what do you mean? She said, what do you mean? Well, I said, let's say that Jesus wasn't an historical figure. I mean, just to say he wasn't. Does it matter? Because in the name of this story, I mean, everybody who's alive now knows this is a story or like an emotion that they give themselves. Oh, I'm in touch with the emotion of whatever it's supposed to mean to us. The same as people do with Krishna or Vishnu or Brahma or Shiva or Kali or Lakshmi or any of these gods and goddesses. Hera, Zeus, Athena, Apollo, Mercury or Hermes. Hephaestus, don't forget Vulcan. You see how these things trail through our entire culture? Vulcan is the name of Hephaestus, so it's the name of the god of the underworld who hammers metal in the cauldrons of the bowels of the earth, and it's also somehow the name of Spock's planet. And you see how the Spock's planet was destroyed in the new version of Star Wars, but in the Star Trek, but in the old one he wasn't. Blah, 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 blah. So we keep remaking these stories and remaking these myths. And they always have to be a little different or we get bored. And if we just make them subtly different, we somehow think they're new. I said, you do realize that we make reality out of myth. Well, what do you mean? I said, well, is Harry Potter real? She said, no. I said, but what do you mean? Is he not real? You know the name Harry Potter. There are more books written about Harry Potter than there are about me or you, so he's clearly more real in that sense. There are theme parks devoted to Harry Potter. There's an entire cottage industry of toys and books and coloring books and backpacks and clothing and Halloween costumes. And there are business offices devoted entirely to Hogwarts and Harry Potter that make money from the creation of these things into real-life sets that people had to inhabit, into movies that people filmed and edited and made, that we all watched, all of them. All of us watched just about all of them. Most people have seen a Harry Potter movie. So is he not real? I mean, is Harry Potter not very real? How can we say he's not real? We know who he is. He's Daniel Radcliffe in the movies. We know what he looks like. We know that his best friend is Ron Weasley. We know that his real best friend is Hermione Granger, who he would have ended up with had he not been gay. Slightly gay. Or am I mixing reality and fiction? how can we say that Harry Potter's not real? He's quite real in our world, which means something else entirely. It means that human beings are not in any way bound by logic or facts for the creation of what we call reality. In fact, it means that reality is an anathema to us. Reality is the thing we distance ourselves from all the time by invoking myth and story. Well, she's a little perplexed at this point. And she goes, yeah, okay, I get it. Harry Potter's real and he's not real. He's real because we make things in the name of Harry Potter. We make businesses. People have made billions of dollars, many, many, many billions of dollars on the back of the non-real Harry Potter. I know Expecto Patronum because of Harry Potter. Wait for the Father, Expecto Patronum. Please, wait for the Father. And it's a Jesus story. Wait for the Father. Expecto Patros, Patronum. Expelliarmus, get rid of it. Expelliarmus, little bits of schoolgirl Latin that J.K. Rowling stuffed into her Jesus tale. And she was very clear, by the way, that Harry Potter was a Jesus story. He was born to a god and a half god. He will die and come back inexplicably. He is the savior. He will save Hogwarts. He suffers all injuries. He's scarred and yet comes back. He fights a snake. I guess that's not Jesus. He is tempted by the devil and hunted by the devil, but that's not really Jesus either, because the Jesus story is just whatever anybody wants it to be, because there are 4 versions of it, and since the 4 versions have been out, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, in the order that they were written, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there's a story to that I'll tell you in a second. But since those have been written, there have been 1,000 other variations, and now people think Jesus is a nice guy who was the Prince of Peace. Nothing could be further from the truth. He invoked war. He invoked the blaspheming of one's own family. Should they not follow his rabbinical drudgery? He killed a fig tree for not giving him figs when he wanted them. He refused to heal anybody who was not in his tribe. And then he was rewritten and he was softened, and then he was finally put into the last sequel called John, in which he was the Alpha and the Omega. He was always a supreme being. He was like, Gandalf or something like that. He was a wizard beyond wizards. He was Gandalf the White, no longer Gandalf the Grey, able to fight and be killed. He was Gandalf the White, invulnerable, never will be killed. These stories track through time, and we were talking about this. And I said, well, Jesus is a sun god. You see, Jesus is a sun god. She said, well, Set was a sun god. I said, yeah, so was Horus, and so was Ra. She said, oh yeah, Ra. And Ra was a sun god. Set was a sun. Why did the Egyptians have so many gods of the sun? Because they worship the sun in different cults. Because they have a different cults that worship, and they name it differently, and they make different stories up about it. Why are there 4 or 5 Fantastic Four movies with 3 different casts? Why is a new mythology written for every show that comes on the air? Why is it easily altered to excuse the need to bring somebody back to life? Agent Coulson, I think. Why do they kill somebody in a movie and bring him back for the TV show? Because they can. Because it's acceptable in myth to kill people and bring them back to life. It's not acceptable in real life to kill people and back in life, so McDreamy is now no longer on Grey's Anatomy because they killed him. And he will not be brought back to life except in dream sequences. But myth doesn't have to follow those rules. That's one way that you know what a myth is. It doesn't follow the rules of real life. So myth is everywhere. And right now there's a myth going on in the world that the 20th century gave birth to the 21st century, and that we're going to keep going up and up and up into a kind of evolution of techno literacy and cyber excitement, that the iPad 6 will be better than the iPad 2, that we need lighter, faster computers so that every 12 to 14-year-old can have a $1,000 laptop that she carries around and covers with Barbie stickers. There was a point in history where anything that cost $1,000 would have been lived in or driven. Not anymore. And it certainly wouldn't have been covered with adhesive. that's not the case today, but it will be the case again tomorrow. Because the myth that the 20th century is going to continue is a myth based on a misunderstanding of history. It's actually a myth based on not looking at history at all. It's a myth based on life since 1988, but not life since 1900 or 1800, 17, 16, 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. It's not life at any point since the founding of Egypt or Assyria, Babylonian Empire, Sumer and Ur. Life has always been a struggle against the elements to make food, find shelter, and reproduce. And it will go back to being so. Not saying there won't be a good deal of fun and a lot of booze and probably plant-based drugs. On the other hand, we may not get there too. Let's bring up the news. Here we go to... I don't have it up. I'm going to have to bring it up. It's going to take me a second. So, I'm writing my book, Official Stories 2. And of course I'm writing about storytelling. Storytelling is the thing that we do, that we think is real. When we watch the news, we are telling stories. We think the stories are true. On the other hand, we know the stories are not true. We're very aware that we're being lied to. But we don't quite care because we kind of don't have to. But we're being entertained, and we know that Bill O'Reilly's a liar. We know he's an absolute alcoholic blowhard of a human being who craps out a book into some ghost writer's hands every 15 seconds to have him finish and polish it. We know that the news is manufactured by corporate will, and yet we watch it, maybe just for the weather report, because that's, as Paul Simon said, the only news that you ever really need is in the weather report. But are any of the stories that we tell true? Not really. Only in part. They only need to be a little bit true. That's the point of Official Stories 1 was that we live essentially in a world where the official stories are all manufactured by officialdom to get us to stop paying attention. The point of Official Stories 2, which will be out in the spring, is that we are the manufacturers of the stories, that we are unable to process long, complex thoughts. We need things to be winnowed down into easy, retellable stories of life and death. So Iron Man has to fight Ultron and win, so that Jesus has to come back and save the good from the bad, so that mighty Thor will go to Valhalla, or Ragnarok, and fight in the Götturamerdung at the end of time forever and ever, because that's the myth that moved the ancient Norsemen, that life was a great battle and the most glorious thing was to be an eternal battle where you couldn't die. We all have our myths. The problem occurs when we think those myths are literally true and we isolate ourselves from good people who have a different myth. I know that struck home. I know you understand what I just said. Jews who isolate themselves from others by saying that you aren't Jewish and you don't believe our myths are losing a lot of good people. Christians do it all over the place. They isolate themselves from other people who don't share their myth, their story, and therefore they lose a lot of good people. I have lost people because of their fundamentalism. I have many Christian friends who do not have a bias against good people. Isn't that interesting? So if you are bound to your Islam, if you're bound to your Muslim faith, and you imagine that your story is literally true, that the one God, a male, spoke to one prophet and told him that jihad in the name of the one God was the way that things must be, and everybody else is an infidel, every non-believer is an infidel who must be converted by the sword. Or you have a softer take on Islam and you think, no, that's not really what we believe. And you exclude all of that, as people exclude the Old Testament reading from being Christian or Jewish. And you still believe this has to be literally true. The story of wizardry and magic, that it has to be literally true. You isolate yourself. Now, whether it's logical or not, let's leave that alone. But if you imagine it has to be literally true, you've isolated yourself from a lot of good people. Let's point the finger at the scientific community that is so busy isolating itself that it can't even pause to see who it's running over. The scientific community has isolated itself into thinking that it is correct. It is the new religion since the Reformation and the Enlightenment. But really, since the age of oil, when we had enough energy to do anything that we wanted, to destroy anything we wanted, we have done so. We have done so. We'll continue to do so. And let's quickly look at the headlines. Rapid stunning, ENE News, rapid stunning, a complete die-off of animals near nuclear site, 150,000 plus, antelopes bleeding from internal organs, pits brimming with corpses. The experts are completely baffled. It's really unheard of, 100% mortality. I know of no example in history like it. It doesn't make sense. Well, if all these animals are dying near this, where are they dying? Here we are. Radionuclide contamination at Kazakhstan's Semipalatinsk test site. 498 nuclear tests were conducted and vented underground. Detonations occurred through 1989. Some Kazakh scientists believe that residual radioactivity is responsible for ongoing health impacts. 500 giant nuclear test sites, and these antelopes get into the area within 200 miles, and then they fall over dead. All of them, mass mortality, from what's being analyzed as a very normal bacteria that shouldn't cause a problem. Sound familiar? When you destroy the immune system, anything will kill you. You're just being returned to the dirt. U.S. government intentionally blew up nuclear reactor outside of Los Angeles in massive human radiation experiment on public. Southern California covered in radioactive plume. Officials documented effects of long-range effluent cloud on people downwind. This is reported back in 1994-95, that the U.S. government staged a 1965 nuclear accident outside of Los Angeles to see what would happen. I really am ready to arrest everybody who claims to be a scientist. Why? Because they've destroyed the world. Floods threaten Fukushima plant structures, nuclear nightmare territory. Experts, a lot of nuclear fuel has actually gone into the ground and will come out at the surface if groundwater rises, which it has done. Radiation levels flowing into the ocean are much higher than usual. What's happened? There's flooding at the Fukushima plant. There's been an ongoing flood in Japan that's killed many and driven 150,000, 170,000 people out of their prefectures, out of their neighborhoods, out of their homes and towns and villages. It's extraordinarily terrifying. And it's flooded the disastrous nuclear power plant in Fukushima, pushing the radioactive plastic bagged material into the ocean, as well as disabling the pumps and threatening the crumbling structures. Yes, I would be surprised if we have 50 years left on this planet. I'm not joking in the slightest, not even slightly. I mean us as a species, 50 years left. I would be unsurprised if that were the case. So a little bit about myth and a little bit about science and the myths of science and the science of myths. We're a storytelling creature, and when we decide that our stories are absolutely true, we create nuclear holocausts. We think that we're in charge. We think we're in control. We create the crusades. We isolate good people from our hearts and minds and villages because we're sure that our God is better than their God. Guess what? They're all stories. None of them are true. And on that note, we're going to head into an interview that Robert Scott Bell, my friend, and I did with Gail Tverberg, who was a little, I won't say shy on the radio, but she had the bearing of a kind of what she is, an actuary, somebody who deals with a lot of numbers. She gave some good facts and good information, and I'm glad that she came on the show, and I hope that she does again. This is Liam Scheff on the Liam Scheff Show. You can support independent artistry and journalism by buying my book, Official. Please go buy my book, Official Stories, at Amazon.com. It's a wonderful, lovely, interesting book that will challenge just about everything you thought you knew about the world. And it will make you laugh. It is funny. Just like life. Life is bigger than you, and you are not me. Sorry, I'm quoting somebody else. Let's jump into the interview, and we'll see you at the end of the show. We will see you next week for a brand new show. I am going to be on the road giving lectures around the country. I will have a movie coming out in select markets soon, a short 15-minute animated feature about oil. and why we have to relocalize food. Let's get right into the interview on the Robert Scott Bell Show. Thanks very much for listening. Don't go anywhere.
Health, freedom, and liberty. Robert Scott Bell.
All right, this hour on the Robert Scott Bell Show, heading into the weekend, it's like seminar time. You're going back to school. I certainly am. And Liam Scheff has been doing a lot of studying, researching, and teaching on the subject. You know, the oil alarm that he's working on. And Liam, you sent me an article a few days ago by a woman I didn't know. She's in the Atlanta area. I wish I would have met her when I lived there all those years ago. She's very smart. And it ties into our discussions over the last couple of years about declining oil and how it's going to impact the economy and our message to go local. I mean, I'm spending a couple hours at least in the garden every morning. Thanks a lot to your inspiration there, and I think we got to go back to that.
We're going to your garden?
Yeah, absolutely.
Everybody's invited.
Yeah, come on. I got some more digging to do. Boy, oh boy, but I'm getting massive. Just called me Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Are you really? You're pumping up a little. Yeah. Well, the garden concept is very, very important because food right now comes from a magical, magical place that I like to call Monsanto land. And Monsanto land is where giant tractors rake the ground and tear it up, destroying the soil, and then we spray not gasoline but natural gas, essentially natural gas that's been put through a boiler, a pressure cooker. They call that, I think, the Haber process. And that is what we eat. We eat the nitrogen that's derived from cooking pressurized natural gas. Does everybody know that? We actually eat the oil industry.
Lovely.
That's what we've been eating for decades.
Well, we need pesticides to kill off the plants that grow in there, so we use more petrochemicals synthesized in a lab to do that. So it's a mess. We know that. Ideal as a homeopath and all the illnesses and ailments that have occurred, because of that. And yet, the issue of oil and money and economy, we're seeing a deflationary spiral, it seems, of the price of gas and oil. And people are saying, how could it be running out? It's got so cheap. So do you want to bring up our guest and introduce her, Liam?
I do. Gail, oh my God. I was going to say Tverberg, but I'm going to let her correctly pronounce her Norwegian name. Is an actuary. She used to write for the Oil Drum, and the Oil Drum is just an incredible resource that was, mocked by the people who said, "Oh, you're all doomsayers," by saying that oil will eventually run out. And then you ask them, the critics, will eventually oil run out? Yes, but, technology will fix it. Let's go back to betting on the odds on the market. So these people at the Oil Drum were doing this very significant work and analysis about the volume of oil that we use and the energy derived from that oil and the amount of stuff that can happen because of that oil. Gail seemed, she was an actuary, and she'll tell you that story, but she seemed to be able to say, look, this is all rooted in very real world stuff. You living in your house, you paying your mortgage, you going to work, systems working, interlocking systems working around a neighborhood, a town, a country, or I should say a civilization requires so many different energies to be happening and feeding that if there's a shortfall in one, there's going to be a shortfall in another that's not anticipated. And that seems to be a big deal of her message, which is there are always unintended consequences from a shortfall in an interlaced locking system. And on that note, I'd like to introduce Gail, and she can correct and
pronounce your lovely last name, Gail.
Well, it's Gail Tverberg, or Tverberg is fine too.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, welcome to the Robert Scott Bell Show. I'm so pleased that you've agreed to come on. I think what you have to say and teach is very important. So without further ado, comment on how we started here, and then we'll go from there.
Well, I got started into this several years ago. I started writing about the issues. I had heard about it back in the 1973-74 period, and I was aware of what it could do to the insurance industry. My background is as an actuary. I then read a book in 2005 about it and started writing about the issue, but I could see that there was a great deal to it, and I decided at that point that I wanted to take early retirement and actually just work on the issue, I found the internet to be a great resource, and with my actuarial background, I could take any kind of database that I found out online and do something with it, put together little charts and graphs and figure out what was really going on. So I had at least some ability to add something to the whole discussion.
And of course, the conclusions that a little bit of what Liam talked about, and we've been talking about on the air here for a number of years. Can you elaborate more on some of these, uncovering for instance, the reason why, oil has gotten cheaper, not more expensive, which doesn't make sense. If it's a scarce commodity, shouldn't it be shooting to the moon to $100, $200, $300 a barrel?
Well, the situation is different than what a person might think. The situation is that we have a networked economy, and we have a number of workers, and those workers are producing goods and services, and they use their wages to buy these goods and services. And so I draw something that looks like a set of a child's toy that builds a set of pickup sticks, or I don't know how it builds a dome out of those sticks, but they're interlaced, and it all works together to create the goods and services we have. And part of that makes that system work is this money supply and these wages that help transfer goods from one place to another, and the prices that help transfer goods from one place to another. And at some point, it costs more to pull oil out of the ground, and it turns out we have problems in other areas at the same time, so it costs more to, say, use desalination for our water, so it costs more for water, at least in some parts of the world. And the metals are extracted from lower quality ores, so they start costing more to extract as well. And all of these things happen. There was some theory by economists that we pay each other's wages, but what they didn't stop to think about was that instead of getting higher wages, what's happening is you just get more people working in these areas. It takes more and more workers to extract the metals, and more workers to build these desalination plants. So it's not that the wages are going up, it's just that we had to move our workers over to these inefficient industries. So the high prices just don't stick. The wages
so basically, Gail, what you're saying is the average worker can't afford it if it goes over a certain level. So I guess there are industries or entities working or manipulating the monetary system to keep the price down, or is there some other nefarious scheme to play us all for fools?
No, what happens is we have all kinds of young people who live at home a lot longer than they used to. And a lot of them are ones who, borrowed lots of money to go to school, and they have lots of debt. But they're not buying houses and they're not buying cars because they don't have the money to buy the houses and cars. And they're buying houses and cars that is what brings up the demand, as they call it, for the commodities. In other words, the things like the oil and coal and gas and steel.
So in other words, if we have kids, younger people, not able to afford the cars, the houses, et cetera, that would demand the growth of the economy, the building of these industries, that explains, at least in part, the deflationary spiral we seem to be in. There are less people able to do it, so that industry can't grow, even if they have access to oil.
Yes, and I think part of what happens, too, is that as we move jobs to China and India, there are fewer jobs in this country, and also the wages of the workers tend to stay lower, and that also contributes to the lack of ability of people to buy the cars and the houses that keep the prices up.
Well, I wanted to get to that simple explanation for a lot of folks because this is a complex issue as well, but how does it impact them, where it hurts in that pocketbook? Liam, I want you in on this too because you've got some depth of understanding here. I want to make sure we cover everything.
Well, it reminds me of studying Italian. When I was studying it does. When I was studying Italian for years, let's see, quando studiavo italiano, we would look at the cultural aspects of Italy, and Italy was broke. Italy doesn't have oil or much of anything in natural resources, so it's dependent on things like olive oil and, food products and tourism. One of the things that was one of our lessons was about how young people lived at home forever and ever and ever, and it was this cultural phenomenon. It wasn't studied in reference to the poverty of the country due to resources, but that's what it was. And now it becomes clear we're becoming Italy in the 70s, 80s, 90s. That's the way everybody's going to become. People used to all live in the same house for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
They had to. That was the roof. That was the house. There used to be cars sitting in, on blocks,
right.
Getting worked on for a reason. You had to work on the old stuff that you have. I think that all of this is very important to understand. We're headed into a place of what we would consider poverty. In that is an opportunity, but it's only oil poverty. It's only plastic poverty. In that is because the earth still grows food. It still rains, except in California, which you have to leave.
Yeah.
And it's still possible to form functional, small local operating states and townships and all the rest of the stuff that we used to have. Well, people don't want to hear that. People don't want to hear that they actually might have to get out in the morning and garden for a couple hours.
It's good for you, folks. It's good for you. By the way, I'm hearing a lot of our American listeners yelling, "Inconceivable!" We don't want to do that. We got it good. Why would we want to go back out and work in the garden? Why would we want to get to know our neighbors? Why would we want to localize energy production, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And we're gonna delve into that when we get back. Our special guest, Gail Tverberg, and she is with us with Liam Scheff as we go back to school here. So we know what to do next. If your parents are going to live with your kids and grandkids, or everybody going to live in the same house, let's find out. And more after this. Links are up in the show notes at robertscottbell.com. Of course, Liam has been writing about this for a while also at liamscheff.com. He's the author of the incredible book, Official Stories. I hope you have your copy. If not, get it, and you'll be ready for Official Stories, the sequel, eventually as well. Right now, we're talking with Gail Tverberg. She has written another article here. She's quite studied as an actuarial background. But this article at ourfiniteworld.com, we have it linked up. It's titled Deflationary Collapse Ahead. We want to get a sense of your predictions in this. And Liam, I don't know if you want to refine that question a little bit more for Gail, but I'm just curious as where this is going.
No, I want Gail to talk about this article that she's written, which is on her website, Our Finite World, which is, of course, the right name. This is where we live. We live in a world of finite resources, especially considering the way that we use them. And I can hear people saying, no, things last forever. In a trillion years, maybe, but not in a 150-year, mass-feeding, hoarding bubble. So deflationary collapse ahead, ? Is the article from August 26th, and I just want to ask Gail if she can walk us through it.
Well, the kind of things I'm seeing are different from what people had expected. I know a lot of people said, when we get to oil limits or limits of other kinds, what we'll see is high prices. And what I say is no, it's low prices, and it's in fact the low prices that we have right now that are creating the limits. These low prices, as I just was saying, are caused by the lack of demand that you get from, people living together more now because they can't afford as much, and they can't afford houses, they can't afford cars, they're in school, they got all this debt, they're just not doing as well financially as their parents did. So what happens is we have these persistently low prices, and what I expect will be happening is we'll actually have falling oil supply, essentially worldwide eventually, because of these low prices. And, of course, when oil supply falls, when prices are low, it actually tends to fall a fair amount faster than if oil prices were to stay high. The kinds of things you have happening, of course, first what you have happening is things like companies in the Bakken defaulting on their loans, and I would expect that to start happening as soon as September 30th. We're going to see a number of the companies, that's when their financial statements are due.
Right.
Well, it's actually after September 30th, but we're talking into October then.
Sure. Gail, we're seeing a lot of predictions about the end of September, and maybe you're making some connections for people as to why there's a lot of doom and gloom in advance of that date.
Right. Well, what happens is that in the Bakken, companies have borrowed a huge amount of money to extract this oil, and in fact, their cash flow is very negative. Each quarter, from the beginning of their production, they have spent more than they've taken in, and it goes on quarter after quarter after quarter. And they've put together these models that say often, 40 years from now, we're going to be making money, and it will make up for all of this we lost all along. Well, at some point, somebody's going to say, this just isn't working. And we expect that's going to happen come when these September 30th financial statements are published. So we're coming on it shortly. But there's other parts of the world, too. There's a lot of money that's borrowed in U.S. dollars, and it's borrowed by foreign businesses. They might be in China, they might be in Africa, they could be any place. But at one point it looked like maybe we had a good rate of interest or whatever, but because of the currency changes, now it becomes harder for them to repay the debts. So that's another kind of a place where we expect debt defaults. And I think China is one place where we're likely to be seeing debt defaults in the not-too-distant future. So all of these things wrap into the situation.
All right, we got to take a quick break here, Gail. When we come back, let's go further into what this means, how it rolls out. What do you see or foresee in these economy shifts, and how does that play into what Liam and I and many others now are starting to see? We've got to change the way we live, not in the crisis, but in preparation for it. Stick around. We got lots more to do with Gail and Liam Scheff here on the Robert Scott Bell Show. This is one where you're going to want to re-listen to this show. I mean, I'm already, my wheels are turning as I'm listening to Gail about this to help understand the mechanics, if you will, of what we're going through in this lifetime right now. Liam Scheff is here, Gail Tverberg. We've got her linked up in the show notes at robertscottbell.com. Liam, we're getting into the financial part of this with Gail, but you have another aspect to why the oil prices are falling. It seems to make a little bit of sense, but also not a lot of sense. It's counterintuitive.
Well, the Saudis have the giant oil fields of the world. We have been pumping. Well, we have been drilling oil, not so much pumping it. We've been flooding oil out of the underground shale, which isn't where we used to get oil. Oil used to be stuff that rather flowed. Make a hole in the ground, it bursts through the cap rock. It's in a sandstone sponge under the ground under incredible pressure, and it bursts up. That stuff has been in decline for a long time. What you have is the heavier stuff. It actually weighs more. It sinks in water rather than floats in water. It's called heavy oil for a reason. It's called sour crude because it's full of sulfur. It's just harder to get. Well, the Saudis said, you think that you're having an oil renaissance over there, and it costs you $70 or $80 to get a barrel out of the ground. Considering that oil cost $1 to $3 a barrel for most of its existence, from like 1900 to 1970, what we're paying now is rather outrageous, and nobody seems to understand that having $70 a barrel oil changes the nature of this economy entirely from the $3 a barrel oil, $2 a barrel oil that was being paid in the 50s and 60s. So, when we were building this this country. So the Saudis said, okay, we're just going to drill full out now, and we're going to sell our oil for $40, so you're going to have to match that. Well, guess what? Exactly what Gail said. These groups are defaulting on their loans and not going to be able to go back. In the beginning of the year, in February, I think, January, they were shuttering a lot of their operations and putting a lot of their drilling equipment up for auction for sale. So where does that take us?
Yeah, what's the financial part of this? How does it tie into what Liam has added into the mix here, Gail?
Well, I think it if you look at it a little more broadly, you discover that Iraq is the one who's wrapped up their oil production as well. And the Saudis, compared to the amount the U.S. had ramped up our oil production, is very much smaller. So, you have to kind of look at it all together. There's so many people you could each point fingers at who's the bad guy, and you could say one is a whole lot worse than the other, but they're all in it. And it would take more than just a Saudi cutback to fix the problem. It would take a big piece, a real big piece, and it would really put Saudi Arabia into a terrible position in terms of being able to support its own financial
well, there would be a revolt. There would be a revolt in Saudi Arabia.
A revolt. So it's not like it's sitting there with a nice option that it could cut back its production and everything would be fine and they can live happily ever after. It's like they're being put in a box as well. So, I don't really want to point fingers.
That's not what I was.
Yeah, no, we want to understand the mechanics more than.
Yeah, I wasn't pointing fingers. I was explaining that they're drilling full out now, and they have been, right. And that means that they can undercut our price, which undercuts the shale price. So I just wanted to reflect, and I guess Iraq is part of that. So thank you for
Iraq is a big part of it too, and we're seeing it throughout the world that the countries are pumping full out because they desperately need the revenue. So when the prices go down, they pump harder, they don't pump less. And part of it, too, is all of the derivatives that are out there. When the derivatives are in place, it's not like these companies really feel the price drop. They can continue as if the price were at the high prices they were before.
Wow.
So the derivatives are part of the story as well.
Well, and the derivatives unwinding back in 07, 08, 09 caused the absolute collapse at the time almost of the banking system.
Well, and I think that is one of the big issues I'm concerned about now. I think we have, two different problems. One is all of the bank defaults we're going to be seeing, and the other is the possibility that the derivatives are going to have a big problem. And it could be derivatives with respect to oil prices. It could be derivatives with respect to the different commodity, or what would you call it, the exchange rates of the different types of currencies. But all of these things are likely to cause problems for banks. And the banks are going to run into big financial problems, and they're going to need big injections of money. But what has been said in the discussions over the last several years is that, we can't, there's so much objection back in 2008, 2009 to all of the
bank
financial
bailout.
injections. Yeah. They said, we're not going to do that again. What we're going to do is we're essentially going to take it back out of people's bank accounts.
This goes into what happened in Cyprus and I think a little bit in Greece, where they just come in and give you a haircut. They say, we're taking this amount of your savings.
Right. Or what you may have happen is you can only take out a fixed amount per week. Your money is still there, you just can't get it out. Well, this is not a real good deal. But what happens then is that feeds into the deflation even further because people have even less to spend for oil products at that point in time. So what tends to happen is that the more and more places around the world experience, the Saudis or others might experience revolts, and they might have to cut back on their productions because of the revolts, and some of them cut back just because of low prices, but it feeds on itself, and we get the oil production to go down quite quickly.
Wow. And this changes, of course, the source of energy, the grid, the availability of electricity. Of course, we're talking about people now, those who have argued for sustainable living. Some have been accused of being hippie-dippies, but everybody's going to have to figure out that it isn't about being a hippie, it's about being viable at this point.
Right. Now think about the way the media spins this. Fox News says anti-American insurgents are impacting our oil supply. It's not ours. It's, some other poor country's oil. And then that's the story that goes around the world. And NPR, does a thing about how women's rights are being violated in some country that happens to be an oil supplier. Right. And
then the U.S. military goes in and says we got to take care of those humanitarian issues, and it's
or they talk about it, but it takes a lot of oil to run the U.S. military.
Yes, it does.
That's going to become a problem.
Yeah.
They're going to have to hoard it, and the rest of the people are going to have to sort of wait in line, and we're going to be a more stratified society, as we really always have been historically. I take Gail's point very well. I appreciated that point that they're pumping full out, not just to undercut us, but I sometimes I think that with the Saudis they sort of enjoy it, but maybe I'm wrong, and they actually have to do it because they built themselves onto what I say, we've built ourselves into the highest branch of the tallest tree. We built this heavy civilization way up here. And so they have to keep pumping just to keep their coffers full because they have a huge unsustainable population in the middle of the desert in which everything has to be imported. So I think that was a really good point, actually.
Yeah, well, and as you brought out also in our own country in California, the lack of water.
Our Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, our Saudi Arabia in a sense, and the standard of living there for people who have been artificially inflated, whether it be the entertainment industry, other industries, the biotech, and other things. There's a big problem, and the point is we're not doomsayers and alarmists in the sense of being irrational about this.
You're all going to die.
Yeah, thank you, Liam. But Gail is very rational about her assessment here, and I think that's why I wanted to get her on along with Liam to talk about this, to give another perspective. You don't hear us yelling and screaming, but putting a perspective out there so that you can make some alterations in the way you live, what you think is a viable investment for your future, and start living differently.
Yeah, what's going to happen to the banking system likely? What's the likely?
Well, I think the intent of the governments by these haircuts is they will keep the banking system open indefinitely, but it certainly is not going to function in the same way as it has before, and I think it's going to adversely affect international trade. I think the electrical grid is likely to be adversely affected very early on, even though many people have assumed that, our problem will be high oil prices, we can just move over to electricity. I really don't see that as being a good substitute either.
Wow. And think about it from the banking system perspective. If they start threatening to cut your savings or limit your access to money, more people are going to pull out of the banking system, and it's going to go to the local barter economy. I mean, it's viability and survivability. People are going to recognize their efforts are not going to be rewarded accordingly, even on a lower scale, if they can't access what they're doing, right? The evidence of what they're doing, so to speak, as evidence of the work. So I think that the banking system is in big trouble as it's come to be known as an international, interwoven, intertwined kind of system.
Right, it's the banking system that allows international trade. If we didn't have that, things just wouldn't work out. And of course, we really need mortgages, and we need car loans and those kinds of things if we're going to continue to build these big objects that people would like to buy.
Yeah, but look at Cuba, last, how many decades of sanctioning, and they're still rebuilding 1950 cars out of parts that they make themselves, if you will, or salvage. And the families all live together, the generations live together. That's to Liam's point, is that if you don't have this artificial construct of oil-based economy, easy access to international goods at a cheap price, it changes if I call it quality of life, everybody defines quality a little differently, but as it's come to be known, the quality of life goes down, although if you start gardening, you realize that there are some good qualitative benefits of going local and getting to know your local community.
Yes, I agree with everything you just said. I'm sorry.
But a city like Atlanta, where Gail
Gail was going to pick that up.
Yeah.
I visited Cuba earlier this summer, and I guess one of the things I noted was that the birth rate is way lower than the other Caribbean nations, and
right.
A big reason for that is the poor nature of the economy, the fact that the families are so much grouped together in the small houses. If you've got it full of more people than a house full of more people than it can hold, and there's no possibility of building another house, you're not going to have a big family.
Yeah, so birth rates are going to drop as well. Listen, we're out of time this segment. Stand by. We're going to come back and wrap it up after this absolutely fascinating, very important discussion. Please tell your friends, share this. Links are up through Natural News Radio, of course, GCN, our syndicator, iTunes, Stitcher, as well as TuneIn, Epic Times, and across the pond at UK Health Radio. We'll be right back.
The Robert Scott Bell Show.
All right, all of the contents of today's program can be found in the show notes at robertscottbell.com, linking out, of course, to Liam Scheff at liamscheff.com, as well as Gail Tverberg, and she is at ourfiniteworld.com. Her article that stimulated to this hour's discussion, Deflationary Collapse Ahead. Please read it, learn about it, stay plugged into what she's writing about. It can be the difference between surviving, if thriving, and how you define it can be in the coming years, especially if you have kids or grandkids. So, Gail, once again, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
And Liam, thanks for connecting us all. Oh my gosh, this has given a whole other layer of understanding to what's happening.
Right. Well, Gail's an important voice and maybe one of the sane. Well, there's so many sane voices in the peak oil, should I say, research movement, but it's generally been dismissed by the market because the market believes that everything is replaceable by something else. This little chimpanzee cage on, lower Manhattan where guys get in their cars to bet on the future of the world in 15-minute increments of testosterone-induced rage. That's Wall Street. Why do they know anything? Why do we grant them anything? What she's doing is making a gentle, sane systems analysis based on her actuarial and other investigative skills. And she goes around. Didn't you go to China?
Yeah, I was in China for a month earlier this year. They paid me to come over and teach at the Petroleum University in Beijing.
Oh, yeah. That's stunning.
It is. So what was that? What did you teach? And what was the response?
Well, I taught about energy economics and how this whole system works together. And in fact, if you look at my presentations podcast page of my ourfiniteworld.com website and you scroll down, you'll discover I have both my presentations I gave over there. I think it was a series of about 7 or 8 of them, and then the videos that go along with them.
Wow. Well, we've got links to that, and it's very easy to just click on it when you're over at Our Finite World. What is your perspective on China? How aware are they of the change, the transformation of the economy of this planet?
Well, part of what the people who invited me over there wanted to see was how much the economy there was contracting. So part of what I did was I went on 3 different trips after I taught this very intensive 2-week class. And when I did that, I actually talked to people in different electricity companies. I talked to people at the Daqing oil field. And I saw for myself, that they were talking about these big cutbacks in orders and how hard it was for them to sell electrical equipment right now and such things. So I think they're quite aware. They were not experiencing the same kind of job loss I would expect, just because things had been growing so fast. And, of course, with the cutback in the birth rates affecting things, the number of workers there is not growing fast. The young people coming up are more and more coming from the one-child families. So they're not being affected too badly with unemployment, just because there aren't too many young people to employ.
Mm-hmm. But you have that in China as a mandated limitation. Is that not right, the one-child family?
Well, they're going back more towards the two-child families.